So here we are, trying to understand whether cultural differences in moral psychology can explain political conflict over issues like climate change. Now we're trying to do this in 5 claims, and we've come to the final claim, the 5th claim. This is a claim about how morally framing an issue might affect who regards that issue as a moral matter. Do you think that environmental issues are moral issues? Well, that may depend on the kind of framing that those moral issues are presented to you with. Do you think that issues over the official language of a country are moral issues? That may depend on the framing with which those issues are presented to you. So let's have a look. Feinberg and Willer's claim, this is the 5th claim we're interested in, is this: exposing conservatives to pro-environmental appeals based on moral concerns that uniquely resonate with them will lead them to view the environment in moral terms and be more supportive of pro-environmental efforts. So the claim. Why should we accept this? Well, this isn't proof of the claim, this is important background to the claim. Feinberg and Willer did something very interesting. They analysed environmental rhetoric from video and print media, and they found that that rhetoric tends invariably, almost invariably, to emphasise harm, care, and perhaps also fairness. So the literature is framed in a way that would naturally make it more appealing to people who are socially liberal than people who are socially conservative, if we accept the claim about cultural differences. Now comes the intervention. So what we need to do here is to see whether changing how the issue is phrased changes to what extent people regard this issue as a moral issue. So here's what Feinberg and Willer did in study 3. Some subjects were given, this was a, what do you call this? A kind of op-ed piece, an editorial, I guess you would say, an editorial style article, and people divided into 2 groups. They got one or the other article. One was phrased in terms of harm and care, just as you'd expect. So stuff like the harm and destruction that humans are causing to the environment. But the other was phrased in a way that's unconventional, was phrased in terms of purity, how polluted and contaminated the environment has become, and how important it is for people to clean and purify the environment. Now, I couldn't get the actual articles, interestingly, so I didn't find supplementary materials for this paper. So if anyone knows where those are, do let me know, because I would love to see the actual articles that they used. As far as I know, we can't see those, we can't access those, but correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, you get the idea from this. So very simple manipulation, and what they're doing is they're measuring afterwards the pro-environmental attitude, the strength of the pro-environmental attitude that the participants expressed in a questionnaire. So you read the editorial, one group is framed in terms of harm, the other group's framed in terms of purity, and then you answer some questions about how pro-environmental you're feeling. And interestingly, actually, there were 3 sets of questions. So there was what we're looking at now, the pro-environmental attitudes, support for pro-environmental policies, and also scepticism about climate change. And the results across all 3 things were broadly consistent. So we're just going to look at these, but you'll see the pattern. So when you give a neutral article, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, there's also an article that's phrased in neither term. You get the classic pattern. Liberals, people who identify as socially liberal, also seem to be more concerned about the environment than people who are socially conservative. We knew that already, exactly what you'd expect. Very good, the study's working. When you phrase it in terms of harm and care, you get exactly the same pattern. Statistically speaking, no difference. That's to say, no difference between neutral, harm, care. There is in both cases a significant, highly significant difference between people who identify as socially liberal versus people who identify as socially conservative. But look what happens when you put it in terms of purity. That difference goes away. That difference goes away. There's no longer a significant difference between the 2, as far as we know. Right? Now, they didn't test to see whether the Conservatives and Liberals were the same. The stats are a bit different, and if you look in the notes, that's explained there. This graph here is just for a kind of illustration to see what's going on. What we're mainly interested in, of course, are the interactions between the conditions and the pro-environmental attitudes. Very good. So it looks like this is effective. It looks like, just as Feinberg and Willer claim, framing things in terms of purity, a moral foundation which they think appeals more to conservatives than to liberals, makes the conservatives more pro-environmental. Now there is a twist here, and this we'll come back to later. It's an interesting twist. They report parallel results regarding belief in global warming That's to say that people who were socially conservative reported greater belief in global warming when exposed to the purity or sanctity message than to the harm, care or the neutral messages. Now this is bizarre because you wouldn't think that reading an editorial style short piece could somehow change your belief in global warming, right? So I think this should be puzzling. This should be puzzling to us. What's going on here? Why are they finding a difference? Not just with kind of, I'm feeling a bit more positive about the environment, but, you're going from sort of, I don't really believe in science to maybe actually some of the things scientists are saying are not obviously false, at least where they're all agreeing, right? At least where they're all agreeing. Gosh. Okay. So I think this is a puzzle. We'll come back to this. So Feinberg and Willer hypothesized, as you know, that if you expose conservatives to purity, or they also predict loyalty to one's in-group, respect for authority, then you'll find that they shift to thinking about the environment in moral terms. But they don't just say view here, they also say be more supportive of pro-environmental acts. So they're inviting us to ask the question, will this also translate into action? Will this also translate into action? And although their study doesn't address that issue, there are other studies that do address this very issue. One of them, one of my favourites, is by Kidwell and colleagues for 2013. And what they did was create two kinds of leaflet. So they created a leaflet they thought would appeal to people who are socially liberal. And here you can see some text from the leaflet itself. This is the actual leaflet. You can make a difference by recycling because you know it's the right thing to do. Your actions can help care for others, and so on and so forth, right? You get the idea. And this leaflet was distributed in two areas, one where predominantly liberal people lived and one where predominantly conservative people lived. They also created a second leaflet, and you can sort of see how this is going here. You can join the fight by recycling with those like you in your community. Your actions can help us to do our civic duty because recycling is the responsible thing to do in our society, and so on. And what you can see here is that there are in-group loyalty appeals, civic duty, respect, follow the advice of our important leaders, respect for authority. But interestingly enough, there isn't a purity appeal here, as far as I know. And what they did again with this leaflet, they again distributed it to two groups of people, houses. They put it out to people's houses. And one case, it was a socially liberal, broadly socially liberal area, and one case was a more socially conservative area. And what they were interested in was very simple. How much stuff would people put in their recycling bins following distribution of these leaflets? Would it make a difference? Would it make a difference? So you've got a kind of 2x2 design. You've got people who live in a more socially liberal area, people who live in a more socially conservative area. And you've got them receiving a message which is either socially liberal or socially conservative. So it can be congruent. If I'm socially liberal and I receive a socially liberal message, it's congruent with my own position. Or I could receive one which is incongruent. That would be socially liberal person, socially conservative message, or conversely. So very interesting. Now, there's one thing to note straight away here, because this will be important later. You think I'm sort of quibbling with this. It's actually going to be important later. You notice that they also introduce some irrelevant differences. So one's phrased in terms of make a difference, and the other's phrased in terms of, join the fight. Now, that difference itself doesn't seem to map onto any claim about differences in moral psychology. So we should keep an eye out for this. Why is that going to be important? It's a strange thing for them to have done, right? Because on the face of it, it just looks like the experiment's not very well controlled. But I think we'll see that there's a reason why they did this. Anyway, the results are absolutely stellar. The results are marvellous. So what you see here are the number of weeks. So this is the pre-intervention period and this is the post-intervention period. Pre-intervention period, you see that there is essentially between the different groups no difference in how much is being recycled. No statistically significant difference anyway. There's nothing that we can measure there. Good. So that helps us. And now you see that those people, whether socially liberal or socially conservative, who got a message which was congruent, I'm socially conservative and I got the socially conservative message, I'm recycling more than people who got the incongruent message or who had no appeal. So the congruent message is making a difference, the incongruent message is not. Marvellous, very good. Now I can show you the same data set, but the results expressed in a slightly different way. So here we can think about the average weight recycled each week. And what you can see here is that if I'm socially liberal and I receive the socially conservative appeal, the one that's linked to the so-called binding foundations like in-group loyalty, I'm actually recycling less by weight than if I received the socially liberal appeal, and conversely, for the social conservatives. So these are some really stellar results that Kidwell and colleagues got, and that's encouraging because it suggests that in answer to our question, it's not just that it changes how people think, but it can also change how they act. And that gives us hope, because what we really want, of course, is for people to support policies, to support, for example, getting rid of carbon generating ways of creating power and so on. Now, in another study, Wolsko and colleagues did something very interesting. So I mention this because it's a nice variation. What they did was they allowed their participants to make a donation to something they called the Environmental Defence Fund, which I guess is a nicely careful chosen name there because it sounds good wherever you are politically and morally. Anyway, and what they show essentially is comparable to what Kidwell and colleagues show. You can see the similarity in the figure here. The amount donated increased for the Liberals when they got something which appealed to individualising versus binding foundations. So if you put it in terms of fairness versus in terms of in-group loyalty, you'll get Liberals to give more. Conversely for the Conservatives. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Conversely for the Conservatives. Very good. So there's that lovely interaction here. This is very interesting. When you frame things in a way that appeals to the people that you're speaking to, it seems that it's not just that they change their views about the environment, but they are actually more supportive. They're more likely to give money, or they give more money. But in order for this to be a robust phenomenon, I think it's fair to say we want to see this going the other way as well. So if the moral reframing effect works, it ought to work both ways. That's to say, we ought to be able to take an issue which is stereotypically one that someone who's socially conservative would care about, and find that we can change Liberals and get Liberals to think about that issue in a moral way. Now here I think the evidence isn't quite so strong, but there is some evidence. I'm going to actually skip this. So Day and colleagues found no evidence, but that may be because of a defect in their study. So that's interesting, but we don't need to worry about that too much. In a different study from 2015, Feinberg and Willer looked at this issue of what's called support for English as an official language. So this is a North American context, the US. I didn't know this, but the US apparently doesn't have an official language, and apparently some people on the right in the US think that it would be a good thing if English was made the official language of the US. Right? Now, I'm not somebody from the US, I don't know a lot about US politics. This means nothing to me. I'm just taking this completely on trust. But perhaps somebody, if you know more about this and I'm getting something wrong, do tell me. I feel very much out of my depth here. What's very nice about this is that they offered an appeal to people to support official English, and either they did a standard appeal or they expressed the appeal in terms of fairness. And what you find is that conservatives, people who identify as socially conservative, they just don't care how the appeal's framed. They have strong support for this regardless. But interestingly, the Liberals, significantly weaker support when you give them the standard expression of the standard material on official English. But if you frame the issue in terms of fairness, suddenly the Liberals are up there with the Conservatives. They think this is a marvellous thing and we ought to have English as an official language. So that's very good. I don't actually know whether the UK has an official language or multiple official languages. I think that things are special in Wales, of course. I'm not sure about the UK as a whole. I don't even know if there's any sort of political issue like this in the UK. The other thing they found is that you get broadly the same result, whether you divide people up. So here people are divided up as conservatives, those are the triangles, and liberals, the squares. And here you're dividing people up, triangles who are relatively low on fairness issues compared to purity, in-group and the rest, or relatively high on them, and you get substantially the same results whichever way you go. And that's just what we'd expect, because our view is that these effects are likely driven by the moral psychology rather than the political identity as such. What we haven't addressed here is a background issue, and I've decided to put that aside because I think the evidence on this isn't very strong. Is it that political identity drives moral psychology? Is it, as Graham and Hyde and colleagues say, that moral psychology drives political identity, or are the two things just intermeshed? Now, we're not addressing that in this course, and I don't think that we've got good evidence either way, despite the dominant theory, Graham, Hyde and colleagues, making a strong claim that the moral psychology drives the political identity. The important thing for us here is that the result seems robust whether you divide people up by political identity or via moral psychology. You get essentially the same thing. Very good. So the question was whether liberals' attitudes can also be used by, can liberals' attitudes also be changed using ethical reframing? And the answer is yes, they can, right? They can be shifted on conservative issues. That's important because it should give us more confidence that this moral reframing strategy actually works. Very good. So we're there, we've done it. The claim was that exposing conservatives to pro-environmental appeals based on moral concerns that uniquely resonate with them, so in terms of purity in one case, or in the Kidwell and colleagues in terms of loyalty to one's in-group and respect for authority, when you have those kind of appeals that uniquely resonate with conservatives, you'll find that conservatives not only view the environment in more moral terms, but are supportive of pro-environmental efforts to the point of giving more money to an environmental charity than people who are socially liberal. Now, just at this point, you could say it's all over, but there is a really interesting question that I can't resist going into. If you've had enough, totally understand, here's a good point to stop. The question is, look, if moral reframing is effective, why isn't it used more? We noticed that Feinberg and Willer, in their study 2, identified that practically all of the literature on climate change was expressed in terms of harm and care. If climate is such a big issue, well, it is such a big issue, isn't it? You know, given how big an issue the climate change issue is, given how little time there is left, right? Given how much has happened since the 60s, when even the president of the US was prepared to stand up and give a speech about climate change, given how little has happened since then, you think, gosh, you know, people would be, you know, trying everything, trying every possibility. But yet moral reframing seems hardly to be used at all. Why is that? Well, in another study, this is a 2015 study, Feinberg and Willer asked a group of people who were socially liberal to present a persuasive argument to a group of people who were socially conservative. And they even told the socially liberal people, look, if your argument actually persuades people, then we're going to give you a financial reward. I think they put them in a lottery for a $50 prize, something like that, which apparently motivates people. It doesn't seem very motivating to me, but, you know, apparently that's the way to do it. So I trust them. And what's really striking here is that the people who were socially liberal were just really rubbish, So less than 10% provided an argument that actually fitted with conservative morality. Nearly 70% just gave an argument in terms of standard social liberal concerns, and about a third of them actually argued against socially conservative ethical issues, right? So they offered a kind of conflicting argument. So the moral reframing, the attempt to get people to morally reframe, in many cases drove them to do the opposite. And the people who were socially conservative, given the same task, present an argument which is convincing to people who are socially liberal, did essentially the same thing. They weren't better. Only about 10% of them, a bit less than 10%, actually managed to produce an argument that fitted with the liberal morality. So essentially, people is bad. People is very, very bad, whether unable or unwilling to shift moral perspectives. They're just really rubbish at doing that. And if you're unwilling to do that, then of course moral reframing is out of the window. So why is that? Why is people bad at moral reframing? I think there are three possibilities. And two of them are highlighted in this passage from a very nice review paper about moral reframing by Feinberg and Willer. So they say, if we don't recognise that our political rivals possess different morals, then I can't reframe. That's very important. Nor, if I lack a clear understanding of what the different morals are, then I won't reframe either. So there's two things that I think are absolutely essential, and it could be that either or both of those is missing. But there's a third thing. In the previous lecture, we looked at the very interesting study by Skitka and colleagues from 2005, which showed, among other things, a whole variety of studies, but showed that people are less tolerant of differences in moral versus non-moral attitudes. And in particular, where they looked at social distancing, they found that how far you want to keep your distance from me doesn't depend on differences in attitudes generally. So we might have very strongly held attitudes about, you know, football teams or music. That's not likely to pull you away from me. But if we have differences that you or I identify as moral differences, then we're likely to keep each other well apart. We're likely to stay very apart from each other. So there is a possibility here that people just find it extremely distasteful, or are, perhaps for whatever reason, unwilling or intolerant of moral reframing, even though they know that speaking to the other side and getting broad consensus is essential if we're going to have a democratic solution to the problem of climate change, and we'll need that quite soon, of course. So that's interesting. People are terrible at moral reframing, and there are some good reasons why that might be. But our concern isn't that. I'm sorry, I'm taking you away from that. Our concern really is just this idea that when you do reframe arguments, then you can change people's attitudes. You can turn a non-moral issue into a moral issue for an opposing side, and that works both ways. We've seen very good evidence that this is true.